This is Pocky and Rocky Reshrined, or Kiki Kaikai Kurumanto no Nazo as it's known in Japan, one of the finest examples of 2D pixel art on the market today, that also happens to be an exceptionally good action game. This is one of those cases where after playing something, I just knew I had to cover it on the channel. It's just that good. A true love letter to classic run and gun shooters reborn for a new era. So on today's video, I wanted to take a step back to highlight the amazing works of its developer, Tango Project, which has a rich past going back to the early 90s, while showcasing the beautiful visuals of Pocky and Rocky Reshrined and comparing it against the Super NES original on which it is loosely based. Technically, Reshrined also stands as a shining example of a Unity game done right, at least mostly. So with that said, let's dig in. At its core, Pocky and Rocky Reshrined is a complete re-envisioning of the original Pocky and Rocky, released for Super NES back in 1992. But what's perhaps most surprising about the specific release is the simple fact that it was created by key development staff that had previously worked on that original Super NES game. This is the foundation of Tango Project, the small team behind this new game released 30 years later. The journey from Super NES to modern platforms, however, was a long one, but that journey begins in 1986 with the release of an arcade game known as Kiki Kaikai. Created by Taito, Kiki Kaikai is an overhead run-and-gun shooter rooted in Japanese mythology. Its core game design resembles Capcom's Commando from a year prior, but its unique themes and twist on the formula result in something that feels truly magical. It was a success, and following its release in arcades, it would receive multiple home conversions, including an excellent PC Engine port, yet it remained exclusive to Japan. That is, until 1992, when a home console-focused sequel was developed for Nintendo's Super NES. It follows the same basic design principles of that arcade original, but features more varied scenarios and creative level designs, pushing the concept much further. It's also the first entry that would be released in the West under the title Pocky and Rocky, but unlike that arcade original, it was not developed by Taito. In fact, it was simply licensed out and developed by Natsume's internal Japanese development team. The thing is, during this era, Natsume quietly produced some of the very best action games ever made. This includes games such as the very technically impressive Shatterhand, known as Tokyu Shirei Soulbrain in Japan, where it was based on a live-action series of the same name, Shadow of the Ninja for NES, 2 Pocky and Rocky games, another licensed sequel to a Taito arcade game with the Ninja Warriors again, and an original shooting game known as Wild Guns. And the 3 key staff members behind Tango Project worked on most of these games. Which almost brings us back to the modern era and the first mention of the Tango Project name. This is Omega 5, released in 2008 for Xbox Live Arcade. It's a dual-stick horizontal shooter with a remarkably catchy soundtrack that is unfortunately delisted and unavailable for purchase in any form. A 3DS version was even planned at one point, but ultimately it was not to be. It's in 2016, however, that the true mission of Tango Project became a reality, with the release of Wild Guns Reloaded, and again in 2019 with the fittingly titled The Ninja Warriors once again, both based on the similarly named original releases on Super NES. It was a chance for the team members to revisit games they had previously worked on while perfecting the formula, with new features, an improved presentation, and more. While simple in concept, the execution is simply superb, with some of the best pixel art, music, and design for games of this style. Ultimately, it's this combination of nuanced gameplay within a simple framework that defines Tango's games. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the Ninja Warriors. When you first begin playing, you're presented with a straightforward left to right action game. You can jump, attack, and use a special move. And that'll work for a while, but within the first stage or so you'll bump up against a difficulty wall, and that's when you begin to experiment, realizing that there's more to this game than you might have first thought. By combining directional input with tapping or holding your action buttons, you can perform a wide range of moves. Jump while pressing down on the D-pad and you'll lunge forward, or hold the attack button to block, for instance. Keep holding that block button, however, and you'll discover that you can flip forward or backwards too. And that's just the beginning. You'll soon feel a buzz of excitement as you string together combos while soaking up the beautiful pixel art visuals and allowing that superb soundtrack to wash over you. This feeling is the key to Tango Project's games, and I'm happy to report that the remake of Pocky and Rocky not only excels in exactly the same way, it may in fact be the team's most ambitious recreation yet. Like the original game, Reshrined is effectively a run-and-gun shooter played from an overhead perspective. You'll begin the game as the Shrine Maiden Sayo-chan, known as Pocky in the West, while making your way through the various stages, taking out foes along the way. You're initially limited to a story mode, which asks you to take control of a wide range of characters with story sequences playing out between each stage. Once you complete this mode, you can also jump into the free mode, allowing you to select any of the characters you've unlocked and play through the game in two-player mode without any of those interstitial scenes. No matter which mode you play, however, it's a fast-paced, beautiful shooting action game. But what makes it such an ambitious remake? Well, it begins much like Wild Guns Reloaded and the Ninja Warriors. It recreates that original Super NES game with greatly enhanced, higher resolution pixel art. From this very first stage, it's clear that without the constraints of memory and storage to worry about, the team is able to push the visuals into an era of 2D graphics one might associate with the late 90s, when such games were actually rather scarce due to the popularity of 3D. It's what one might have envisioned if the Sega Saturn had been a smash success around the world. It's absolutely packed with detail and life. And as you continue, you'll begin to notice that individual sections have been dramatically altered from the Super NES original. Like this path here, for instance. It's now depicted as a twisting rocky staircase, lending the stage additional variety over that original tile set in the 16-bit version. Beyond this, the enemy patterns throughout this stage and the types of foes that can appear together has been greatly expanded. You'll recognize many elements like this, of course, but much of the level feels tweaked and changed to suit this new game. Now, when you arrive at the very first boss, you'll again find yourself on familiar ground. The design is similar and it plays a lot like you might remember, but after taking him down, a second phase begins that was not present on Super NES. It's another hint of things to come. Once you finish him off, however, you're greeted with these story sequences just like the original game, but with new artwork to go along with it. And of course, as always, the music is exceptional, delivering brand new iterations of classic tracks from this original game. It's when you arrive at stage 2, however, that you'll begin to notice some changes. In story mode, you'll actually change characters, now taking control of Rocky instead. And it's clear that the stage design has been greatly altered, as the entire introduction to stage 2 is all new. There are moments when you'll cross paths, of course, but it's a longer, more detailed stage all around. Eventually, you'll arrive at a vertical section which bears a strong resemblance to that original before encountering a mini-boss which showcases the massive increase in sprite size made possible in the new game. The rest of the stage plays out familiar, including this boss here, but again, with some expanded encounters. Eventually, you'll arrive at this floating raft sequence which carries you along the river as you dish out attacks to invading foes. It inevitably climaxes with this massive boss fight that is far more nuanced and impressive to behold in the new game. But it's only when defeating this foe that the game truly begins to shift gears. You see, in the original, the adventure continues as Pocky and Rocky make their way through a haunted cemetery and on their merry way. In the remake, however, Pocky is seemingly killed, leading to a completely new series of stages. I won't spoil things, but the story takes some interesting and sometimes unexpected twists along the way. You do eventually reconnect with some of the stages based on those from the Super NES game, like the airship, but the actual level design and enemy encounters are radically altered. It may as well be a completely new game that just borrows some elements from that original, rather than something like a typical remake. It's fantastic stuff. Now, just like Ninja Warriors and Wild Guns before it, Pocky and Rocky has a lot of hidden depth that makes it an exciting game to play and replay. Initially, you'll find that shooting while simply dodging projectiles is the name of the game, but you'll quickly become overwhelmed, making it tough to complete even the very first stage. And this is where the nuance comes into play. You'll soon discover that your melee attack not only vanquishes nearby enemies, it also destroys and reflects enemy projectiles. This quickly becomes both a defensive and offensive strategy that is augmented by the addition of a dash move with invincibility frames and a bomb. Partway through the game then, you'll gain other abilities as well, and all of these stack on top of one another, creating a game that really rewards and sometimes even demands skilled play. It's very satisfying to learn. Thankfully, the controls feel quick and responsive when playing on the Switch, and the presentation feels superb throughout. But from a Digital Foundry perspective, it's the way in which this and Tango's other games are developed that I found so fascinating. The three key members of this team have basically produced games on their own under the Natsume label for decades. It's a rare example of old school game development persisting into the modern era. That is, these guys are still making games like 1991. Of course, this style of small-scale development never truly disappeared thanks to the rise of indie games, but it's heartening to see these legendary developers continue to hone their craft 30-something years later. Of course, they've also fully embraced modern tools in building these new games. Like the prior two releases, Pocky and Rocky was created in Unity. In that sense, I feel like their work is a true showcase of what's possible with 2D pixel art in the Unity engine. They managed to avoid nearly every pitfall that has plagued so many other Unity games, delivering something that feels extremely authentic and polished from top to bottom. From simple things like ensuring that there's no visible loading screens between gameplay and cutscenes, or the way the art perfectly adheres to the pixel grid structure. Moreover, none of the visual effects ever really feel out of place for this style of pixel art, and they're able to take advantage of the extra capabilities of Unity to push the interactivity forward somewhat. Case in point, these interactive leaves you'll encounter right at the start of the game. There's a ton of stuff like this, there's just so much animation and motion happening within each level. The game's menu also includes scaling and scanline options for those interested. The scanline option is somewhat self-explanatory. It's designed to simulate the look of an older CRT. It works reasonably well. There's a granular slider here, and at the higher values, it actually tries to simulate the look of red, green, and blue phosphors. I found this filter was effective primarily in portable mode on the Switch, but wasn't really necessary when playing on the TV. The default scaling mode then fills the screen, and the aspect ratio looks correct. It does seem to be a widescreen game, but it is also slightly wider than the art itself. If you set it to 100 by 100, you get pixel perfect scaling. When using the default mode, however, you might observe some very minor shimmering during scrolling, but honestly, I feel that this sharp, nearest neighbor scaling is actually the best option, and vastly preferable to, say, linear blurring. As it stands, the game is currently available on Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 4 then. It was released in Japan very recently, and this is the version that I imported. Just like the old days, right? But it is arriving in the West this June, both in digital and physical form. So that begs the question then, which version do you choose if you're interested? I mentioned earlier that this game makes great use of Unity, and that's true. It sidesteps most of the issues we've seen in other similar games. But the keyword here is most, because on Nintendo Switch it is not quite flawless. Essentially, on Switch, the game has performance issues during gameplay. It's always targeting 60 frames per second, but if you look at the frame time graph here, you can see that it's not able to sustain this at all times. When the action heats up, the performance begins to degrade slightly. Now, having finished the game on Switch, I can't say that it's not as bothersome or frequent as I had feared, and in fact the second stage is probably the worst offender of all, but it is worth noting. Alas, I don't actually have the PS4 version available for capture, but I did speak with someone who did buy that version while checking out footage of the game running, and it does seem that that version cleans up the issues that I've seen on Switch. So if you're looking for the best performance in this game, I might recommend going for PlayStation 4. But honestly, it's still fine either way, and it's worth noting that both versions managed to run smoother than the Super NES original, which has plenty of slowdown throughout. Thankfully, the dips are minor enough and the only real technical hiccup with this game. Loading is minimal, control is responsive, and everything just looks fantastic. It's especially a treat when paired with the Switch OLED. So yeah, at this point, hopefully you have a good idea of what to expect if you decide to pick up this game, but if you're a newcomer to the series, you might find some of those earlier stages slightly frustrating, so let's talk about that briefly. My biggest tip here revolves around taking your time and learning the mechanics. You see, at many points throughout the game, it is actually possible to just sort of rush through and attempt to bypass many of the enemies, but this often leads to overcrowding of the screen, creating patterns that become much more difficult to dodge. It's best to try and deal with each group of foes as soon as possible. Due to the nature of the game, however, the actual enemy patterns are somewhat less scripted than you might find in a typical vertical shooter. This ties into the run and gun nature of the game, where you have free control over movement. Enemies definitely have predictable attack patterns, but you can't always rely on them to execute exactly the same way each time, and this is why it becomes important to prioritize foes based on their potential attack patterns. Knowing which type of attack to use, when to dodge, when to use your special, and how to deal with enemies is all part and parcel with the experience here, and that's where a lot of the fun comes into play. Keep in mind though, this is not a dual stick game, and while that could have been a fun option on the surface, it isn't really suited to the design of this game. Now, Pocky and Rocky Reshrined is not exactly a long game either, although it is about twice the length of the original Super NES version, but a lot of the fun comes from learning and mastering the game while taking in the sights and sounds on the way to victory. It's a perfect pick up and play game, and it makes for an excellent two-player co-op experience. So yeah, Pocky and Rocky Reshrined. It's a special game that, along with their prior works, has cemented the team at Tango Project as one of my favorite developers around today. The amount of passion and skill poured into each release never ceases to impress. Now, if you're also interested in checking out the past entries of this series, the original Kiki Kaikai is actually available on the Taito Egret 2 Mini, complete with vertical screen orientation and TV output options. It's pretty good on there. Of course, you can also pick up the Arcade Archives version on PS4 or Switch. Sadly, as far as I can tell, the original Super NES games are not available on any easy-to-access platforms in an official capacity, that is, though the Game Boy Advance game did make an appearance on the Wii U Virtual Console. It may even still be available right now. So that's my take on the Kiki Kaikai series and Tango Project as a whole. If you couldn't tell, I love this series and I adore the amazing work of Tango Project on bringing games like this back to modern platforms. If you're into 2D action games like this, I honestly cannot recommend it enough. And if you're new to the series, give it a chance and adapt to those controls, and I promise it will eventually click. But that's going to do it for this video. If you want to see more coverage of smaller games like this in the future, definitely let us know, as it was a lot of fun to make this video. That's all for now though, thanks for watching.